Thank you for introducing me. So today, actually, I'm going to share my research that was part of a bigger project that was launched by Professor Krzysztof Nowodka. It was devoted to the question of epigraphic culture in the territory of the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean in antiquity. So we managed to gather quite a lot of scholars, epigraphers, who covered specific regions and cities. And what we did, we collected all the epigraphic materials there, and we counted it. So we focused on statistics, and we prepared graphs representing local epigraphic curves. And we managed to cover quite a lot of regions. Of course, it was impossible to cover all regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, but we've got Boeotia, Delphi, Olympia. We've got two test cases from the Black Sea region, the Northwest Black Sea region that was covered by me, but also Chersonesus and the Bosporan Kingdom that was studied by my colleague Michał Halamus. Then we've got the cities of Miletus, Ephesus, Pergamon, Phrygia, Phoenicia, Alexandria, the Fayum Oasis, so quite a lot. So here on the left, you've got a map representing all those regions and cities covered by our research. And on the right, I've marked the cities that I was responsible for. So Olbia, Istros, Calatis, and Mesembria. And today I will focus on the city of Olbia, especially on that particularly interesting moment in the history of the city, the 3rd century BC, which is very often connected with larger local crisis, economic, also the demographic, climatic. So what was the aim of our project? So first of all, we wanted to study statistics based on the epigraphic material, and we tried to offer some explanations why in certain periods we've got the so-called epigraphic minima and maxima. So the moments where we've got more inscriptions produced locally and moments when we have less inscriptions. So the idea was that we can link the chronological distribution of inscriptions with specific moments, very important political events, or some changes in the constitution of a given city over time in antiquity. And indeed, as it turns out, sometimes it's possible to link the output of inscriptions with specific political, social, cultural events. Then we were looking for any trends, global but also local trends that can shape the epigraphic curve of a given city. I can tell you that it was quite difficult to find any global prevailing trends that would be universal for every region. What we noticed was that actually we can talk about many epigraphic cultures, even though we focus on one region, the Eastern Mediterranean. We've got so many local phenomena that had a very important impact on the shape of the epigraphic habit of a given city or region, that it's very difficult to talk about global trends. A few words about the methodology we applied. Of course, we were not the first scholars who were interested in epigraphic culture. There were other scholars such as McMullen or Meyer who also tried to do the same. I think that our methodology was slightly different. And also, we didn't want to focus only on the Roman period, as it was in previous research. We wanted to count all inscriptions from the whole history of cities and regions, all inscriptions in all languages, Greek, Latin, also in other languages if possible. And our methodology was that we arranged our material by century, but also by quarter centuries. So each of us tried to prepare two graphs representing local epigraphic habits, arranged by centuries and quarter centuries, because we assumed that would help us to detect any significant trends, local and more global trends, phenomena in the local history. We divided our material into several categories. So these categories include decrees, tituli honorari, epitaphs, and an additional category that would specific for our region. Usually we chose dedications, and I also chose dedications for my material because they were the most significant category. And we counted only those inscriptions that were made in stone and metal. So we didn't count graffiti and papyri because that would be too much. We decided to limit our research to the inscriptions made on durable material. The inscriptions that were not possible to date, to at least to a century, were not taken into consideration. So we decided to exclude them from our graphs, and that's also a big difference when compared to previous research on epigraphic culture. So here we've got a table representing all regions and the number of inscriptions that were counted. So as you can see, I was quite fortunate because I didn't have that many inscriptions when compared to other people. Some of them had several thousand inscriptions to count. I had only slightly over 1,400, so it wasn't that bad to count, and only 4 cities. I keep my database updated, and since that time, since the book came out, which was 2021, I managed to add a few inscriptions, but the overall picture has not been changed. So I just added a few additional inscriptions to my database. So if you are interested what the overall picture looks like, the epigraphic curves of the whole all regions of the Eastern Mediterranean that were covered by our research. Here we've got a graph representing all every piece of research. Mine is beige, so you can see the bottom. Maybe it's not very noticeable here, but generally what you can see here is that there are two noticeable moments in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean when we have noticeable peaks, the number of inscriptions. The first peak is dated to the Hellenistic period, to the 3rd century BC, and the other smaller peak in the first few centuries AD, which is quite. I think someone has their microphone on. And the second peak, which is very characteristic, generally when we look at the number of inscriptions that survived till today, most of them date to the Roman period. Here, this huge peak maximum, the 3rd century BC, is mostly caused by two regions: Boeotia, when there is a lot of epitaphs from this period, and Delphi, where there is also a very interesting phenomenon, a lot of manumissions that were for some reason popular in that period, manumissions produced on stone. And when we add all these numbers, we'll end up with a graph like that, with two noticeable peaks, the first and secondary maximum, which is quite interesting because today we will talk about the 3rd century BC, which looks like a period where we've got that secondary maximum in the Eastern Mediterranean. And now we'll move on to my research. And here we've got a table with numbers that were already updated. So from Olbia, we've got 560 inscriptions recorded. I excluded those that turned out to be fake inscriptions. And from these, nearly half are of public nature. The other half are considered private, because we know that they were issued by private people, or sometimes we just don't know. And if we don't know if an inscription is of public nature, we prefer to treat it as if it was private. The number of inscriptions that were possible to date is quite good. It's nearly 80%. The rest, I had to exclude them. If it was impossible to date, I had to exclude them from my research. But 80%, nearly 80%, is not that bad. And then the number of inscriptions that were possible to date by quarter century, it's slightly over 30%, which may look like not a lot because it's actually 1/3 of the whole output of inscriptions from Olbia. However, they are quite evenly distributed over centuries, as you will see in a moment, with a small exception for the 2nd century BC, where from which we don't have a lot of inscriptions dated so precisely. But besides that, the distribution, the chronological distribution of these inscriptions is quite proportional. I can also mention that some of the cities were easier to count. Some of them were quite complicated when it came to chronology, especially Mesembria. I had to look for any possible ways to date inscriptions that were not dated in the corpus. The best, in my opinion, the best corpus, well prepared, well edited by Alexandru Avram, who was an excellent epigrapher, was the one that pertains to Calatis. It was very easy to count Calatis thanks to that corpus. And the types of inscriptions again. So as I mentioned before, we've got decrees, including the so-called leges sacrae. Actually, there was one lex sacra from Olbia. Then tituli honorari, epitaphs, dedications, a very important category from Olbia, because we've got a lot of dedications, especially from the Roman period. And the last category, that's generally called other inscriptions, that includes letters, affixiones, all kinds of building inscriptions, all kinds of instrumenta domestica. And the epigraphic curves of the four cities look like that. The epigraphic curve from Olbia is colored blue here. And what we can see here is first the 4th century BC, which is considered the period of the maximum prosperity of Olbia, the city, and also the chora, the countryside of Olbia. And then we can see a sudden drop in the number of inscriptions in the 3rd century BC. And that's the thing that we will focus on today. And we will try to look at this period, and I will try to offer some sort of explanation why we've got such a drop in the amount of inscriptions, and how we can link this fall in the number of inscriptions with specific events, changes in the political and also demographic, social life of the city. Another interesting thing is that here, the 1st century BC, which is a very good example of how certain events, historical events, may have had a very important impact on epigraphic curves of specific cities. In the 1st century BC, all cities faced the attack of the Gitae, who were led by Burebista. And in all these cities, we can notice a very dramatic drop in the number of inscriptions. In Olbia, that was destroyed during that attack, we've got actually a gap, a lack of inscriptions from that period, which very clearly shows how political event may influence local epigraphic curve. But going back to the 4th and 3rd century BC, we can look at this graph here, showing the distribution of Olbian inscriptions by century. And again, here we've got the 4th century BC and 3rd century BC with sudden drop in the amount of inscriptions. And here, graph representing inscriptions from Olbia by 4th century. And again, here we can notice that sudden fall in number of inscriptions from the beginning of the 3rd century BC. But first, let me explain why we have such noticeable maximum in the 4th century BC, a huge amount of inscriptions compared to previous quarter centuries. This century is very important when it comes to Olbia because we have evidence that early 4th century BC was the time when democracy was introduced in the city. So besides the statistics, the amount of inscriptions, when we look at the content, you can see some signs proving that probably around that time democracy was introduced to the city constitution. For example, we've got the bully and demos mentioned some of the inscriptions. We've got the first public dedications around that time, and we've got also the cult of Demos, the cult of Zeus Eleutherius, similarly to the cult of Zeus Eleutherius from Athens, which may also point to democracy being more popular in the city. And then another interesting thing, we've got the first non-abbreviated decrees from that time. What does it mean? It means that from that time on, decrees were issued in a proper regular form. Before that, in previous centuries, we've got abbreviated decrees, which were similar to decrees issued, for example, in Miletus, the mother city of Olbia. So that change in the way in which decrees were issued might also point to some important change in the political life of the city. And then we've got that sudden fall in the 3rd century, and we know it from other sources, including archaeological sources, showing that there was something going on in the Black Sea region around that time, which was probably some sort of a crisis, economic, but also climatic, demographic crisis. How do we know that? When we look at the city, you can see that there was a gradual decline of Olbia, but also a very noticeable phenomenon of shrinking the chora of Olbia. At some point during the middle of the 3rd century BC. We know that there was some movement of peoples around that time, both from the east, movement of nomadic people from the east, Sarmatians, but also Scythians. There was a movement of peoples from the west that we know from the Protogenes inscription, Celts and Germans. When you look at the soil, you can say that there was quite considerable climatic change. Summers became dry, winters became more severe, so there was food crisis and so on. Another thing very often occurred in literature is it's called collapse of great Scythia. So a lot of Scythian settlements ceased to exist, which also shows that something was going on in the steppe territory. So it was not possible anymore to live there, or there were some events taking place that forced people to move to somewhere else. Another thing that I will also discuss is the phenomenon of commemorating euergesia that became quite popular. Not only in Olbia, but also in other cities of the North and West Black Sea region. Benefactors were in fashion at that time, and it was quite popular to commemorate them with an inscription, and that also impacted the local epigraphic curve. And another important category of sources is numismatics, and here I will focus a little bit more on coinage. Especially I will focus on Vladimir Stolba's research on monetary crisis during that time, not only in Olbia, but he also discusses Chersonesus and Pandika, so the Bosporan kingdom. And he noticed that actually that crisis, monetary crisis, can be found not necessarily in the middle of the century, which is the most common moment connected with the crisis, but already at the beginning of the century, we can notice that coinage started to deteriorate. And that's visible in the proportion of base and precious metals that were used in the alloy. So you can see that there was more and more base metal added to the alloy, and also the coin weight was reduced gradually. And all of that can be noticed during the first half of the 3rd century BC, and not only in Olbia, but also in other cities of the region. What else? We can see that also coins made of bronze deteriorated considerably. We've got instances in which coins that stayed in circulations were recycled, so to say. So they were overstruck and countermarked again with new types. And then we've got finds of hoards spread along the northern Black Sea shore, which also shows that something bad was going on during that time, that people decided to hoard their coins, and they were usually bronze coins. So at some point, precious metals were actually, they weren't used, so you didn't have silver and gold coins at all. And all of that is actually contemporary with the fall in the production of inscriptions in Olbia, which also proves that the beginning of the crisis took place at the beginning of the century rather than in the middle. And also, when you look at the epigraphic curve of other cities of the region, you can see the similar tendency. Here we've got a graph that I borrowed from my colleague, Michał Halamus. And here we've got the inscriptions from Chersonesus. And in the middle of the century, we've got a drop in the amount of inscriptions as well. And when we look at the distribution of inscriptions from the Bosporan Kingdom, the situation is very similar to Olbia, where we have a very dramatic drop already at the beginning of the century. And here we've got Olbia again, with that sudden drop at the beginning of the 3rd century. So the question is, what actually happened during that time? Why do we have such a dramatic drop? Does it mean that Olbia was already in financial trouble at the beginning of the century? Probably yes, because we've got a decree honoring the sons of a certain Polonius, who granted the city quite a big loan of gold coins, and the city that's actually granted his sons, which means that the loan was granted years before the inscription was issued. The city was still not able to repay, so the loan was still there, and that means that the inscription is dated to 255 50 BC. So the loan was granted, as I said, sometime before that. So not only the statistics, also the content of inscriptions can tell us something about the situation during that time. When we look at the bronze coinage from Olbia, it's called Porucznik, we can see that there was a process of how the coinage was deteriorated. So first we've got around 2% of the additional lead being added to the alloy, and over time that percentage changed, and it reached around 5% in the last issues of bronze coins. So it was a process during which the coin deteriorated. The coinage that was used to produce new types of new types of coins that were of lesser quality was initially dated to the second half of the 3rd century BC. That was the most commonly accepted date, and that was because those issues of the Porucznik were understood as the bronze coins, the halkoi, that were mentioned in the Protogenes inscription. And because the Protogenes inscription was dated to second half of the century, therefore it was assumed that those issues should also be dated like that. However, already in the 80s, the numismatist Anochin noticed that we should look for the beginning those new corrupt issues of Borysdenoi somehow at the sometime at the beginning of the 3rd century rather than in the middle of the century, because first those coins were struck over quite a short period of time. It was no longer than 20-30 years, and only the last issue around 280 BC started to be countermarked and overstruck. And also he compared coins that were found in hoards of Olbia with other corrupt coins. For example, this coin on the right from Pantikapayon that was also countermarked, and that also proved his chronology, showing that the corrupt Borysdenoi should be dated to the beginning of the century. And another thing when we discuss the 1st century BC is the second half of the century, where we have a sudden rise in the number of inscriptions, you can see here, which may lead to a false conclusion that perhaps during that time the city of Olbia overcame the crisis. However, when we look at the nature of these inscriptions, that they were mostly decrees, we can see that most of them are actually honorific decrees commemorating the act of euergesia, which means that the crisis was still there. There were rich, influential people who wanted to help the city, and for that they were commemorated by the city with an inscription. And a good example of that is the aforementioned protogenes inscription. Interestingly, benefaction did not always include money or distribution of goods. In fact, when we look at all kinds of benefactions recorded in Northwest Black Sea region, distribution of goods constituted only 10% of them. So there were other ways to help the city, for example, by holding public office, which was also quite expensive, and not everyone could afford that. So here we've got an example of how local tradition, tendency can create shape the epigraphic curve. So in the second half of the century, we still have crisis in the city. And yeah, here, as I said, that the 2nd century BC is not a good, it doesn't reflect the actual amount of inscriptions from that century, but because not a lot of them are dated so precisely to a quarter century, but from that century generally we have less inscriptions than from the 3rd century BC, which shows that the city never recovered fully from the crisis. And to sum up, I can say that I agree that the epigraphic habit of a given city can reflect both the development of that city and all political, economic changes that can be noticed over time. When it comes to Olbia, the epigraphic curve can prove that the crisis took place slightly before it's usually believed. So probably not in the middle of the century, but slightly before that, sometime at the beginning of the 3rd century. Also, it's important to compare the statistics that come from the epigraphic material with other kinds of sources, other categories of sources, archaeological material, numismatics. Otherwise, we can draw false conclusions, like in the case of the second half of the 3rd century, that may look as if the city overcame the crisis. But in fact, when you look at the nature of the inscriptions, you can see that it was not like that at all. And yeah, that's all. Thank you a lot for listening, and I'm waiting for your feedback and comments, questions. Thanks.